Hello again. Tonight we're going to talk about a commercial alternative to NASA's Deep Space Network. And if you're not familiar with what the DSN is, there's a little primer information up front. So the DSN's been around more than 50 years now. When we were first sending probes out into our solar system, the radio antennas that we had on Earth that were to pick up low Earth orbiting things weren't good enough. They weren't big enough. The receivers didn't amplify enough. So we had to build bigger antennas. One antenna wouldn't do it because the Earth rotates, and the thing out in space, if it's going to the moon, the Earth is going to rotate underneath the orbiting moon. And so the antenna will be out of communication with that deep space probe. We weren't even thinking of manned equipment at the time. We were thinking of, something exploring the solar system. Unmanned probes. So we had to build the Deep Space Network to be able to communicate on a hopefully near continuous basis with all this stuff we're sending out into the void. Now we've upgraded it over the years for different probes that we've sent out there. The last major upgrade was for the James Webb Space Telescope. And if you remember the presentation over a year ago we did on the JWST, I discussed the upgrades to the DSN, the Deep Space Network. It was about probes way out in space, like the Pioneers and the Voyagers. Their signal strength is so tiny, billionths of a watt, that you really need to amplify it considerably before you start thinking about doing anything with the received data in the form of decoding it into like computer data. The problem was JWST, in order to maximize its data transfer rate, was going to be using a particular frequency that was really meant for deep space. But if they pointed a deep space network antenna at Lagrange point 2 and attempted to tune in something sent by the JWST, it would have been deafening to the deep space network antenna because it's such a high power transmitter that's at 1.5 million kilometers nearby, so to speak, as opposed to billions of kilometers out in the solar system. So they had to make adjustments for what frequencies they amplify to what levels. But if something is 10,000 miles or closer, the Deep Space Network is not what they use to communicate with it because the Earth rotates and the swing angle would be too fast. So you've got to use something that stays with the satellite orbiting the Earth for that. The Deep Space Network is only for the deep stuff. Deep starts at about 10,000 miles. So think about deep space and 10,000 miles. Oh, that means that if you're geostationary, you're farther out than 10,000 miles. And so maybe for the farthest deep space and the farthest geostationary things and the things that are just past geostationary, you're going to need to use the DSN. So as we add more of those things, that occupies more of the available satellite dish time of the Deep Space Network. There are 3 Deep Space Network stations, and each of the stations has multiple diameter radio antennas because we built newer, higher power things, and they're farther away than the Earth, but still high power. So the farthest away things, like the Voyagers and New Horizons and such, we use the big dish. Big dish at each site. There's only one big dish at each site. And as the Earth rotates, you switch which Deep Space Network antenna is targeting which deep space object. And there's actually a website called DSN Now. And you can actually Google DSN space NOW, and it'll take you to it. And that will show you what the Deep Space Network is looking at right now. When they wanted to improve the Deep Space Network, they had to get money from Congress because these are not trivial improvements. They're many millions of dollars to go build additional antennas and all of the high tech behind them, like critically cooled receivers and supercomputers to handle all the data. So you need some bucks. But remember, they don't just listen, they also talk to these deep space items. So if you remember the recent issue we had with one of the Voyagers, where NASA sent too new an update to Voyager 2, and it said, okay, I can point that direction. And that wasn't facing Earth. That would have been facing Earth maybe a month from now. So we had to wait a few weeks until it caught up, and okay, now it's pointing back at Earth again. Don't do that ever again. But also the Deep Space Network, since it transmits and receives, is used for radar. Well, the Arecibo big dish in Puerto Rico used to be used for asteroid radar. So, we can optically see asteroids in space, but in order to judge their rotational rate and their surface shape, we would do radar imaging of those asteroids that we detected optically using the Arecibo dish in Puerto Rico. But now that that's gone, we're now using other means of doing that. So these smaller antennas at the Deep Space Network are occasionally used for planetary defense programs like asteroid evaluation. But they've also said, well, what happens if we have too many things to do? Well, we can use the Green Bank radio telescope in West Virginia. If there's really an asteroid we're serious about, Green Bank has the ability to send out radar and receive it back. And so we can do that if we get stuck for a pinch. But, oh yeah, the U.S. Congress would not give the National Science Foundation money to continue to have Green Bank be operated as a U.S. government facility. So now if, let's say, the NASA Planetary Defense Program wants to use Green Bank for radar observing of an asteroid, bring your cash, bring your wallet. So they have to rely upon the Deep Space Network, which is kind of a fixed budgetary item to do that. But if it's all booked up or subscribed, how are you going to find a time slot where you can do your radar observation? And that's what they're coming to find, is that DSN's got a lot of work to do. But the DSN is not used for commercial satellites in orbit about the Earth, and it's not used for military satellites that are of, let's say, a military or clandestine purpose. If you happen to be watching cable TV and you know that your HBO signal comes in via satellite to your local Comcast satellite TV network center, coming off of that satellite, it's not the Deep Space Network. It's, Comcast has their own transmitting facilities and their own receiving facilities, or they might outsource it to Hughes Networks, which has their own satellite transmitting and receiving facilities. So whenever you drive past, let's say, a giant property that has a lot of satellite to-do stuff, you'll see a fenced-in area and big white dishes in the background. Those are probably private satellite receiving stations for Earth geostationary orbiting satellites. But if they're for Earth resources, like NASA's Earth resources, those are NASA satellite dishes, or they're the Deep Space Network if they're a geostationary. But if they happen to be the latest venues of private Earth resourcing, like you want to know about your agricultural potential capability in Brazil, pay a private company to do some agricultural research from low Earth orbit for you. Well, that satellite receiving station is not Deep Space Network as a private facility. There's money involved in that. For the military communication satellites, yes, there is, in addition to the Deep Space Network, there is also an Earth Space Network as they call it, for want of a better name. Scientists are always coming up with these, what are we going to call the next telescope? The Big Bada Boomba one, because we've already used large, very large, and extremely large. What do we call the next one? Well, same thing. We've got the Deep Space Network for the things that are deep in space, and then the stuff that are closer to Earth, we just call that NASA's Space Network. So we have those. The military and government surveillance satellites, they have their own ground stations. Netflix actually had a short-lived streaming series called Pine Gap about the station that's multinational funded. It's Five Eyes funded down in Australia. It's a fun watch. If you're a small satellite operator, if you're doing university CubeSats or something like that, you can't justify the big budget for those things. So if you wanted to make it Earth orbiting, you've got to go pay for some of the satellite communication. If it's deep space, like, there were some CubeSats sent to Mars along with Perseverance, and there were some CubeSats sent to the moon when Artemis 1 orbited the moon. What network are you going to use for that communication? NASA's Deep Space Network. Satellites are getting smaller and smaller. We went from CubeSats to nanosats to picosats. Now they're talking about femtosatellites. Now, how small would a femtosat be? A femtosatellite is an orbiting satellite smaller than a playing card. One side of the surface is a solar panel, and the other side is some kind of sensor, a microwave sensor or a optical sensor or a phased array radio sensor. You don't just send out one of these things, you send out swarms of them. But the swarms don't stay together, the swarms spread out, which means you need to simultaneously be receiving signals and communicating up to them in different directions. And if you're using an individual giant satellite dish for every one of them, you can't afford to pay for that. So it falls back on NASA's DSN to do all of the very small satellite, educational satellite, that kind of stuff. And the way that NASA does that is they charge you a small fee. It's called the NASA Commercial Communication Services Division. That's oversubscribed, or there's a lot more small satellite stuff out there that would like to use the DSN than the DSN has available dishes and time slots to use. You know, NASA didn't really want to admit to that fact, because if they wanted more antennas or more bandwidth to do these other programs, then they'd have to go back to NASA's administrator and the US Congress for more budget money. It seemed unlikely that they were going to give them more budget money. So the way that they wanted to prove they needed this done is NASA has, all government agencies have these internal auditors who say, are we getting the money that the taxpayers are paying for back as benefit from what we're paying for? There was an audit. There's currently more than 40 deep space missions, not Earth orbiting, near the Earth, but not in close orbit to the Earth, way out there and to the moon and beyond, and the sun and out to the edge of the solar system. And all of these things add up to each one being a subscription on the Deep Space Network. So as the Earth turns, you want to point that way and listen or talk to that, point that way, listen or talk to that, and you've only got so many antennas. So the audit turned up, yeah, you got a lot of stuff out there. That pretty much booked up all the available slots. The NASA internal audit of the Deep Space Network turned out that there were 40 plus missions that were needing the Deep Space Network. A growing number of them are long-term, like the Voyagers are still out there 50 years later. New Horizons is still out there going close to 20 years later. There's a lot of stuff that we've put out there that we thought weren't going to last that long, like Curiosity, Perseverance, that are lasting a lot longer than we thought. We're putting out newer things at Lagrange Point 2 that are probably going to last longer than we thought. So the oversubscription of the Deep Space Network became an audit visible thing. And the real crux of the matter was the Artemis probe that went around the moon recently, not the probe itself, the fact that it sent out 10 CubeSats. And the CubeSats spread out around the moon being a half a degree in size. That meant that, while we don't need the big dish, we could do with 10 smaller dishes, or at least 8 at each one of the sites, and they only had 3. So how did they do this? How did they stay in contact with these 10 CubeSats? They used the big dish in a amplitude turned down manner because it has a wider field of view. So they used all the small dishes plus the big dish to look at all the CubeSats. So what did that mean? That meant that we had to stop listening to some of the longer term stuff while Artemis was going about the moon. And in particular, the CubeSats. We lost data is the best way to describe it. But if we lost data, that means that the deep space network needs to be bigger. But we're not going to go to Congress and get an incremental improvement, and we're not going to suddenly have 20 satellite dishes at each one of these stations, because that would be, $1 billion+ per station. So how are we going to solve this problem? Well, there's two things that are going to solve the problem. One is synthetic aperture. This is where we take a giant set of antennas, and through supercomputer software, we synthetically create one giant antenna out of it, so we can see a broader stretch of the sky. So if you have a lot of things to look at, maybe you only need a couple of these arrays of antennas, and you can steer them. The next thing up is virtual channels. So if you can have a wide enough field of view, and you bring in a wide range of frequencies, and you run it all through the supercomputer in its back-end processing can pick apart the individual channels from all the different satellites or deep space probes transmitting on different frequencies. Years ago, we realized this in computer networking. If you have a wide enough bandwidth channel pipe, and you put a lot of different channels of data on that one pipe, then you can have a lot of what they call fan in, a lot of channels going in to that and send them out to the other side. And at the other end, you have the computer pick apart all the individual channels and then send them out to all the different computer networks that needed the data. You can do the same thing with radio communications. You can create, through synthetic aperture and virtual channels, a wide antenna that receives over a very broad range of frequencies, sucks all that into supercomputers, and then pulls it all apart into the individual narrowband radio channels or virtual channels to then send the data out to the appropriate corporation, scientific research community, or NASA. So technology has advanced. We now have synthetic aperture and virtual channels. Why don't we do that commercially? Why don't we create a commercial space communication network? As you can tell, it's not far removed from NASA's Deep Space Network selling itself commercially. This is commercial right up front. So what if we take the information that we now have learned about synthetic aperture antennas from LOFAR, that presentation, you can go back and look at that, and virtual channels from computer networking and supercomputers, and now we've got a solution to the problem that's not short-term or short-sighted. What do we have that we can make use of? We have synthetic aperture through interferometry. We have what is known as mechanical cryocoolers. So we don't need liquid nitrogen and liquid helium anymore, which are expensive to maintain, to keep our receivers and our transmitters operating at superconducting temperatures. The mechanical cryocoolers are the same things that the James Webb Space Telescope is using, so it won't run out of helium. That's another one of those probes that are going to last longer than they originally estimated. We now have synthetic, radio receivers or software-defined radios. So instead of having a receiver that can only receive on one channel, we receive over a very broad range of frequencies, and then we can pick out through software-defined radio the individual channels we want to receive on. So we have synthetic aperture antennas, we have synthetic software channelization of the receivers. We can now have one physical feed that can do multiple receive channels to different destinations. But we also know that from looking at LOFAR, they had different size arrays of antennas for different radio frequency ranges, for like the S band, the C band, and the X band, which are different frequencies going from hundreds of megahertz up to tens of gigahertz. It may require a couple of different arrays at each one of the ground stations. You're still going to need multiple ground stations because the Earth rotates, but you're also going to need the back-end supercomputers to do the virtual channel assignments. So what would the scale of this thing be? So in the lower left, I have a picture of the NASA Deep Space Network Canberra, Australia station. And you can see there's a couple of big dishes, and then you can see some smaller dishes. The total number of dishes there, I think, is only like 5. So they can only point to 5 things at one time. The big dish, if the things are close together, like if you're listening to something that's on Mars versus something that's orbiting Mars, you can probably get both of those at the same time on the one big dish. But if you use the smaller dish, nope, you need 2 dishes. So LOFAR, as we saw from last week's presentation in the Netherlands, it's a synthetic aperture phased array. It's got a bunch of little panels that all pick up different frequencies. And then they've got several of these spread over Northern Europe to create a view of the sky. But they're doing radio astronomy for astrophysics purposes. They're not communicating with anything. They're only receiving. Well, this commercial network is going to have to transmit as well as receive, and they're going to have to do it on at least the S, C, and X bands and different frequencies within those bands, because every one of those satellites out there has its own specific transmit and receive channels allocated by international agreement and the U.S., the Federal Communications Commission, to say, what is it going to be transmitting on so you know where to receive? And what are you going to be transmitting on back to it to know how to send to that and not accidentally to something else? Like if you wanted to send to Curiosity, but not Perseverance, and not the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and not the ESA Mars probe, you need specific frequencies to transmit on to avoid miscommunication. So you need software-defined radios for all this stuff. Well, how many of these things are you going to need? Well, it turns out that the dish antennas, those can be almost pointed to the horizon, but the horizon gets to be kind of murky, so they can almost go all the way down. But the synthetic phase tunable arrays don't get quite down that far. So you're going to need more of them over the surface of the Earth than you have giant dish antennas. But luckily, they're cheaper to build and easier to maintain because they're at ground level. When you look at the Deep Space Network, what you'll find is the area around each one of the stations is giant rings of mountains. And same goes true for the Green Bank in West Virginia. It's encompassed by a ring of mountains, which is great for radio frequency interference avoidance. But we're going to have to put these new commercial array stations in a lot of other places where we just had cheap land. But those may be near other things. So we're going to have to put tall fences that are up to the minimum level of tuning of the phase positioning to block out local radio interference. The Deep Space Network has the benefit that, and I'll give you Green Bank as an example of how this works. Once a year, the Society for Amateur Radio Astronomers, or SARA, has an annual conference that they like to do at the Green Bank facility. And they like to take pictures of, hey, look, here we are, the crowd at Green Bank, and there's the big dish in the background. How would you do that nowadays? Well, I just whip out my mobile phone and shoot a picture. No, you don't. No, you don't. Because your mobile phone produces all kinds of radio interference. So you have to turn in your mobile phone when you arrive on site before you get anywhere near the receiving station, and your phone goes into a metallized plastic Faraday shield bag, and you don't get your phone back until you leave. If you brought a computer or a tablet with you, same thing for your computer and your tablet, because those things produce a lot of RFI that, I'm sorry, the radio antenna is just too sensitive and amplifies that, 1/1000th of a watt signal too much. Your laptop's broadband hash, while it wouldn't bother your mobile phone or even your FM radio, might destroy the receiver on the giant antenna. So no local emitters. You want pictures of your event? They still make film cameras. So they buy a disposable film camera, take some film photos of the event, have those sent off to a place that digitizes the images. They don't make prints, they just digitize the image, and they send you your data as an email attachment. These new stations that are commercial, they won't get the luxury of laying down the law for all the local city area around them. They're going to have to be wherever the land's cheap. So they're going to have to put up, if you've ever seen a golf driving range in a large city area, They have these huge nets that prevent the golf balls from slamming into adjoining houses or buildings. Well, they're going to need similar sorts of maybe only 30-foot tall nets because the phased array can't beam down further than that. But they're going to have these tall metallized fine mesh nets to block out all the local radio signals. And within the net area, they're still going to have to confiscate your mobile phone, your tablet, and your computer, and even your smartwatch. I've realized that people wear health monitoring rings. Those things are a computer on the inside, and they send out Bluetooth to your phone. So yes, your smart ring is going to have to be confiscated as well. We'll give it back to you when you leave. But also no RFI emitting vehicles. So the vehicles they use for maintenance at the deep space network, these are old vehicles that don't have computers on them. No electronic fuel injection. It's all naturally aspirated carburetors because they don't need computers. And you can put a giant capacitor on the spark plugs and mitigate all the AM hash to make the vehicles that they use to haul people out to the dish and back, or to haul parts out to the dish and back, not produce any radio hash. So you have to think about all of this stuff when you think about creating a commercial enhancement or additional commercial offering beyond the deep space network. But what about the computers? Sorry to say, you're going to need at each one of these stations a supercomputer complex on the order of teraflops of compute capacity. Not just billions of floating point operations per second, but thousands of billions. For the deep space network, NASA has, there's a picture of one of them, rows of computers. Now, if you remember back to the Forbin project, at the start of the Forbin project movie, they had the thing where they turned Colossus on, and you just saw the lights coming on off into the distance of all the computers coming on. Well, not so much in this because they're inside of racks and you can't see the lights coming out of them unless you walk up to the back of the racks. But all the computers are making lots of fan noise. These computers are very high speed, and they have to measure software down into the nanosecond or fractions of nanoseconds level to synthetically glue together all those radio frequencies across all the stations. So the array of antennas might cost $5 million. The supercomputers behind each one of the stations might be $10 million. So the antenna array is not that much. The supercomputers cost more. And then you need all the backhaul data connections. So you need fiber optic, gigabit level fiber optic for the outbound data, for like that end result data to your customers. Those are going to be gigabits. So lots of infrastructure it's going to cost to do this. But what if you want to transmit data? Let's say we commercially in the future have something on the order of the Voyagers or New Horizons. Let's say somebody wanted to, I don't know, mine precious minerals in asteroids, and they wanted to communicate with their manned station on board a giant asteroid. Well, they're going to be a big user of this commercial network, but you have to transmit to them. If your source of the data to be transmitted is some business office in New York City, that's not where you're transmitting from. That's where your data originates from. But the actual transmitting of it has to be really close to the actual transmitter site. Has to be calculated in real time down to the nanosecond level. So the supercomputers not only know how to process receive data, they know how to receive commands from the commercial customer and package that up into data to be transmitted and acknowledged in real time with the deep space probes. There are protocols for not only modulated but encoding the data to be transmitted and received, and all of that has to be done in real time. But when we talk about real time, it's not instantaneous. Think about, I don't know, let's say you want to send a signal to New Horizons out in the Kuiper Belt, and then you want to get an acknowledgement back and then send an update. You send a signal out, you wait 18 hours for New Horizons to go, got it, before you send now that you've got it, do this. And then you wait another 18 hours for, I've done it, because space be big and the speed of light be not so big. So the installations, the multiple commercial installations, will need to know how to modulate data, how to do command and response processing, and how to demodulate and decode the data on the receive side. So yeah, the supercomputers won't be idle. What about electrical power? Yeah, these are big dishes that are going to be transmitting in the hundreds of kilowatts range for each one of the arrays. So that's going to be a lot of power. Where do they get the power from? Hey, they're out in the middle of nowhere. Great place for solar panels. I won't say windmills because those produce radio hash because they're essentially a giant inverter motor. But the solar panels, yeah, you can get a lot of sunlight converted into that. And if you just, instead of buying 1,000 acres, you buy 1,200 acres. You could put a megawatt level solar power generation plus, battery station beyond the Faraday cage. We're powering it all. So I wouldn't worry too much about the power requirements because I think we've already got a solution for that. And definitely not natural gas turbines or anything like that. And certainly not nuclear fission. No. So I broke this apart into 3 phases of deployment. The first test, X-band only, receive only. And then we get into more complicated things. So the stuff that's way out there in space, those communicate on the tens of gigahertz X-band. And if we just wanted to prove that we can not only receive from it, not send any commands to it, but just receive. We can do the receive side of the deep space network for a lot more channels. So receive only. Let's just cover the US first, because that way we don't have to get into international budgets. We can put one receiving station on the western part of the US, somewhere out in the desert area of California. Maybe if we wanted some proximity, we could put it near Vandenberg. In Florida, on the easternmost part, hey, there's a lot of space up near the Cape. We could put an array there, and there's already rules and for operation. There's power sources, there's data networks, good stuff. But also, for those people that aren't aware of it, there's a place in Oklahoma called Midwest City that has a massive Army base that has lots of military infrastructure and communications and such. And that would be a good place because it's kind of in the middle of the U.S. Almost the same reason why the U.S. military picked the location. It's in the interior of the U.S., away from stuff that might be flying overhead and landing in the U.S. So if we had these 3 stations, we could cover 120 degrees of sky or 8 contiguous hours out of 24 for receiving. I would say initially deploy the equipment only for X-band, just to prove out that we can do the tracking and multiple virtual channels and all that stuff. But like I said, you're going to have Faraday fencing around it because these are near big cities. But it would prove out a lot of these things. The synthetic aperture, the virtual steering, tracking, handing off from one station to another. And it can pick up nearby deep space targets like James Webb Space Telescope, the Euclid Space Telescope that we recently sent to L2 along with JWST, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, Juno around Jupiter, the Parker Solar Probe if you want to catch something moving fast, could even pick up the Voyagers and New Horizons. This is like dipping your toe in the water is not going to be cheap, but yeah, you can start reasonably small. And it's a commercial operation, so don't have to go back for Congress for this, just have to go to a well-heeled commercial provider who sees the vision of, if we do this thing right, kind of like SpaceX did, not only can we get money from the commercial operators, kind of like SpaceX is, but we can start out by getting money from the government operations like they get from NASA for doing the oversubscription stuff that NASA can no longer handle, so they farm it out to the commercial provider, much like they do with Starlink. So I would think that some of these radio, astronomy, science-based groups that are doing things like LOFAR. Their commercial equipment providers might be the ones that are interested in doing this. So the second phase would be, we can do it on all of the deep space communication bands, so S, X, and C. And just to test things out, we might do radar imaging of a few asteroids. Much like it can do multiple channels for different space probes, it can look at radar imaging of multiple asteroids at the same time. So we could do that. That would be a great boost to NASA's planetary defense program, because now instead of seeing just one asteroid at a time, you might have a multiple candidate list that you can go through simultaneously, but you need the transmit as well as receive capability. And then the third phase, go wide commercially. So the next time that somebody puts up into, geostationary orbit a commercial probe, a communication satellite TV, Earth resources, whatever, instead of creating another ground station, which becomes a burden cost to that scientific research program, you could just pay some money to the commercial services division and they can do the tracking for you and take on the responsibility for operations and maintenance. So once you have them all over the globe, and once they can do these primary communication channels, if you want a stronger signal, you can certainly increase the number of stations or the number of antennas per station. Or if you want denser coverage of your synthetic aperture, you can add more stations. Once you get this thing started and it's doing transmit, receive, all three bands, and it's got a number of commercial customers under its belt, including NASA, you have the revenue stream. And once you have the revenue stream, you can start growing things out. Or haven't you noticed this is what SpaceX is doing with Starlink? Now that they've got a number of commercial customers and private residential customers, the money's rolling in. And as the money rolls in, they go, oh yeah, we could do with another 22 satellites. Schedule it. Get that Falcon 9 going. And as they reuse the satellite launch vehicles, the Falcon 9s, they can clean those up and redo them in, a month or so. So you can, in a single week, have 3 missions launching satellites. Well, the same thing is true here. Once you have enough stations to cover the globe and 3 bands, you can be adding new customers commercially for the revenue stream as long as you have the supercomputing horsepower to do it. And once you have the revenue stream coming in, continuous upgrades of the supercomputers are the way to do even more customers. It's a commercial operation, but it's not going to start out making money. I would say from concept through to phase 3 deployment is probably going to be 5 to 10 years, depending upon how aggressive things get. They're going to need hundreds of customers to keep the revenue stream high enough to do all of the maintenance operations and advancement. But one big customer might be all that overload of NASA. So this capability could be doing the next time you launch 10 CubeSats for the moon, or we'll monitor Voyager 1, Voyager 2, New Horizons under contract for the next 10 years, and NASA can start moving some of that full STEM budget money into newer programs. And, the longer missions at places like Mars, this commercial operator could do for you. So you don't have to give up on Perseverance, Curiosity before they're due, before they mechanically run out or have problems. We're going to start sending manned things to the moon. They're going to be there for a while. And we certainly want 24/7 coverage of that. Luckily, until we send stuff to the far side of the moon or to the north or south poles, we can do 24/7 coverage with the deep space network. But we'd like to offload that ultimately. So if there was a commercial facility for doing that, this would be a great way of doing that. So who would step up to do this? So if you look at the long-term investment, it might be, before things get financially profitable, it might be about $6 billion to get those first 3 stations out there and start to expand them. Plus all the back-end stuff, the land buy, the supercomputers, all the networking, all that stuff. You could be, having your competitors using your facility. So I think of it as the customer that might want to do this sooner rather than later would be the company that wants to put deep space things up there and make revenue off of it. So I would think current commercial customers of, let's say, communication satellite, surveillance satellite, Earth observation satellite, if they want to keep putting things up there, they won't have to be creating new capture, private facility. I doubt that the military clandestine folks would want it going over a commercial network, so it frees up those to not have to do with it, CubeSats and such. So I think there's an opportunity here that if a corporation with the money just had the envisionment of what it could be in the future as this thing grows out, as we continue to move out into space long term for a long time. In conclusion, the government's the appropriate starter, like for risky, new or large scale stuff. But once to get the ball rolling, once the technology's there, the private sector, commercial for service rendering fee are the more appropriate approach for doing that. It has been recognized through audit that NASA's Deep Space Network is currently oversubscribed to the point of losing data because you can't have all the antennas pointing everywhere at the same time. And we're throwing up multiple low budget simultaneous satellites. If we want to talk to them when they first go up, there's things that are going to roll off the subscription queue and we won't be getting data from them. And we've already lost data. So how do we solve this problem? Well, you can go back to Congress and ask for billions more in funding for the Deep Space Network, but that's only going to get you an incremental solution. And it might take decades to get the funding, to get the deployment, to get it all operational. If you're a private corporation and you've got the billions up front to get it started, it's probably the environmental approvals to be able to deploy your first 3 stations that is the biggest delay. If you're not transmitting on the first phase, you're just receiving what NASA's already allocated frequencies on. You don't even have to go to NASA and say, we're going to transmit. You won't need that until the second phase. So you can prove out multiple channel receiving before you ever need to go back and ask for use of transmitters. But the transmitters you're using initially will all be already pre-allocated by the FAA and the ITU for satellites that are already out there. So it's not like you need new channels. You're transmitting on channels that are already defined. You're just having NASA look over your transmission facilities to make sure you're not going to, melt the planet or blow things up or whatever. So they just have to do a survey. So doing this commercially makes the most sense. Creating a commercial space communications network, or CSCN, is the best way to go. But we need to find a corporation, and I would think Amazon or SpaceX or somebody like that is probably the likely one with the money and the vision. But it's going to take some time and years. So let's get started now, because the Deep Space Network is oversubscribed and already losing data. And of course, lots of links. Comments, questions? So do you think it will be commercial, or do you think that NASA will just go back to Congress and say, give us a few more billions. We'd like to add, 2 more antennas to each one of the DSN sites. But it'll have to be deployed over 10 years. If you go back and look at the history of the DSN, you'll find that the DSN improvements just for the James Webb Space Telescope took the better part of 10 years.
Well, good luck getting funding approved for something like that.
Well, that's the reason why I said I think this should be commercial. The technology's proven. There's, I think, lots of virtual channel subscription service provisioning revenue for this. Revenue from both commercial operators as well as NASA. I think that the DSN is great for the really critical programs. But once those programs become ho-hum, or Congress goes, why are we still funding that? And then NASA's response is, because it's still working. At some point, there's going to be too many plates spinning, and NASA's just going to have to go, yeah, Congress, you can go ahead and stop listening to the Voyagers because we don't have enough deep space network slot time, because for the deep space network slot time for Voyagers, you're literally transmitting to them on one day and receiving from them the acknowledgement on the next day. You can't dedicate the antenna time for that. So they have a slot for transmitting, and then they use the antennas for other probes, and then they have a reserved slot for receiving. The signal is coming back, when it does. When you send something to a deep space probe, it turns around the processing and acknowledgement in well less than 1 second, because it's the computer on board the spacecraft. So it receives the signal, decodes it, processes it, does the function, and might be a quarter of a second, it's transmitting the data back. The turnaround time on the data is near instantaneous, but the time it takes to get back to the Earth is a day plus. You can't have the satellite antenna reserved for that period of time. So you have the slot for the satellite transmitting to it, and the dedicated can't move it reserve slot for when the data comes back.
No, I was just going to say that you wouldn't have to keep that entire day reserved, but you just pretty much said that. So you have the transmission slot reserved and then the reception slot reserved. And other stuff can happen in between. Yeah.
The transmission slot need not be reserved. The reception slots have to be reserved if they're associated with a previous transmission. And that holds true for anything out in deep space. So when we send something to the moon, we can hold on to the antenna because, a second and a half later, we're going to get a response. We want to send something to Mars. It's 17 minutes. So we might hold on to it if it's something critical. But if we want to send something to Juno at Jupiter, it's 8 hours. You're not going to hang on to the antenna for 8 hours. You're going to send it, and when you send it, creates a reserved, not going to budge time slot for when the response comes back. And anything deeper gets the same thing. If you have synthetic aperture and you have a phased array and you have supercomputers behind it that can do multiple virtual simultaneous channels, all that stuff becomes moot. You don't have to worry about it because you can simultaneously receive from multiple directions on multiple channels at the same time. Your oversubscription becomes, how much horsepower do we have on the supercomputers on the back end? How many virtual channels can we simultaneously pull out? And if you've got a new customer that you're charging a account startup fee of $100,000, you can spend that kind of money to boost the supercomputers because then everybody shares it. If you remember the early days of privatization of the internet and you wanted to go buy yourself a web server, you had to pay for the monthly cost for a dedicated computer for your website. And you had to pay for the monthly T1 costs for your 1.5 megabit data connection to your host side of your website. And then somebody got the bright idea, gee, that's a lot of computing horsepower that just goes to waste because your website's not always active. What if we came up with this thing called a virtual machine where you can run what looks like multiple host computer dedicated websites on a higher horsepower single computer sharing a fatter pipe on the back end? And that's when websites became, $20 a month. And if you pay the $20 a month for a year in advance, we'll throw in the annual domain name registration for free. So this is nothing more than doing what business has always done. Take critical resources, initial customers pay for them up front, and then share them on the back end with a much larger commercial revenue sharing stream. Time sharing computers. Back when you had to own your own or lease your own IBM 370 for your, business corporation's data center. That just became too expensive. So you would rent time on a time sharing computer. These are nothing that business hasn't always done in the past. You take a critical resource that costs a lot of money and you find a way to share it virtually with as many customers as you can, right up until, you remember America Online and their problem with oversubscription of their analog telephone modems? How long do I have to wait to dial in and get busy signals before I can connect into America Online at 19.2 kilobits per second? I remember the solution for that. You take a pencil eraser and you jam it into the return key of your PC keyboard. Whenever America Online would try and dial out and try it 3 or 5 times and just get a busy signal and then come back up and put up a pop-up window, and the pop-up window had a button on it that said retry. In the meantime, you would jam the eraser into your keyboard's return key, and the return key would go return, 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 return. And when the pop-up would show up, it would retry again, faster than you could be there to go return on the keyboard. And those that knew the retry hack for the keyboard eraser were the ones that got into America Online more often. And then they complained about it. And then the US government took America Online to federal court as an aspect of a joint trade commission and FCC, because FCC handles the electronic communications and the trade commission handles the business. And they took America Online to court and said, you're making how many billions? Guys, spend more money on phone lines and spend more money on modems. I do big networks. So, this little thing about a commercial deep space network, that's not the hardest thing I've ever done. But it's up there. But it has multi-billion-dollar revenue potential, where what I was doing just had tens of millions of dollars of revenue potential. But you've first got to have the vision to say, what do we have today? What are the problems we have today? What is a effective, long-term, not just a bump down the road, not just kicking the can down the road, but solves the problem. So that's what this is. This is a commercial solution to the now short-term perceived oversubscription, but eventually long-term deep space communications that needs to be solved, because we're never going to privatize, commercialize space for a variety of reasons until we have a solution to this problem. Any comments or questions before I stop recording? Hearing nothing.